What happens when you stop praying for a while? It doesn't happen all at once. One day you realize the silence has lasted longer than you meant it to. And now, every time you try to pray, your mind fills with guilt before you can even say a word. You still believe in God, but something inside you feels tired, disconnected, almost numb. You wonder if the distance changed the relationship, if God got tired of waiting, if your silence pushed him away more than you want to admit. But what if the thing terrifying you most right now isn't actually the truth? You did not wake up one morning and decide to stop praying. It happened slowly, quietly, almost invisibly. At first, life simply became heavy. Your mind became crowded with responsibilities, disappointments, fears, and questions you did not know how to answer. You still believed in God. You still cared about faith. But something inside you became tired, and exhaustion changes people in ways they do not immediately notice. Achi saw me point prayer, stopped, feeling natural. The words became harder to find. The silence after the prayers felt longer than before. You asked God for clarity, but confusion remained. You asked for peace, but anxiety continued speaking louder than your faith. You asked for strength, but emotionally you still felt weak. So, little by little, prayer became less frequent. Not because you hated God, not because you stopped believing, but because your heart became overwhelmed. Sometimes you told yourself you would pray later when things calmed down. Later when your mind felt clearer. Later when you felt spiritually motivated again. But later slowly became days, then weeks, maybe even months. And now there is this quiet tension living inside you. You still think about God. You still wonder about purpose. You still feel conviction when truth reaches your heart. But there is also distance now. Not necessarily physical distance. Internal distance. The kind that makes you feel disconnected even while sitting in church. The kind that makes worship feel harder to enter. The kind that makes you avoid silence, because silence forces you to confront what has changed inside you. And one of the most painful parts is that nobody else fully sees it. From the outside, your life may look mostly normal. You still function. You still carry responsibilities. You still smile sometimes. But internally, something feels spiritually numb. Your mind feels noisy, but your soul feels quiet in the worst possible way. You remember when prayer once felt easier, not perfect, not dramatic, but alive. Now, even trying to pray can feel emotionally exhausting. You start speaking to God, but your thoughts scatter immediately. Anxiety interrupts the moment. Overthinking takes over. Doubts appear. Guilt enters the conversation before faith even has the chance to speak. And eventually you begin wondering things you never thought you would ask. Has God become distant from me? Did I drift too far? Is something wrong with my faith? Does God still listen after all this silence? Those questions become heavier because deep down, you know the issue is not only prayer itself. The deeper fear is relational. You fear that your silence changed the relationship. And shame has a way of making that fear grow quietly. It whispers things like, if you really loved God, you would pray more. If your faith were real, this wouldn't be happening. Look how disconnected you've become. You used to care more. God must be disappointed. Shame always speaks with the language of finality. It wants you to believe the distance is permanent. That spiritual drift means spiritual failure. That weakness means God has stepped away. But what makes this struggle even more confusing is that part of you still wants God. Even now, even after the silence, even after the inconsistency, even after the numbness, something inside you still longs for peace, still longs for clarity, still longs for connection. That longing matters more than you realize. Because people who are completely hardened toward God do not wrestle like this. They do not grieve spiritual distance. They do not feel the tension between fear and faith. The fact that your heart still aches over this reveals something important, but you may not understand that yet. Right now, all you feel is the weight of the silence. And silence can become dangerous when it is misunderstood. Because when prayers seem unanswered for too long, the human mind starts creating conclusions. You begin interpreting God through your emotions instead of through truth. If you feel abandoned, you assume God abandoned you. If you feel distant, you assume God became distant. If you feel spiritually weak, you assume your relationship with Him weakened beyond repair. But emotions are powerful without always being accurate. Still, when exhaustion combines with disappointment, even strong faith can become clouded. The Bible repeatedly shows this reality, not just in ordinary moments, but in the lives of people who deeply loved God. There were seasons of waiting, seasons of confusion, seasons where fear became louder than confidence, seasons where people questioned, wrestled, grieved, and struggled internally. Sometimes modern faith creates the false impression that spiritually mature people always feel spiritually strong. But Scripture reveals something far more honest. Human beings are fragile. Emotions fluctuate. Fear rises. Hope weakens. Minds become overwhelmed. God has always dealt with real people carrying real internal battles. That matters because one of the enemy's greatest lies is convincing you that your struggle makes you uniquely disqualified. But your exhaustion does not surprise God. Your anxious thoughts do not shock Him. Your emotional numbness does not confuse Him. Your silent season did not catch heaven off guard. And yet, when you're inside the struggle, it feels deeply personal. You replay your inconsistency in your mind. You remember moments when you ignored conviction. You think about all the times you could have prayed but didn't. And slowly, prayer itself begins feeling intimidating. Not because God became unreachable, but because shame makes connection feel unsafe. That is one of the cruelest effects of guilt. It convinces wounded people to run away from the very place healing exists. So, instead of moving toward God honestly, many people slowly withdraw internally. They distract themselves, they stay busy, they avoid stillness, because stillness exposes the ache they've been trying not to feel. But eventually, exhaustion catches up. You cannot endlessly outrun what your soul needs. There comes a moment when distractions stop working as well. The achievements do not fully satisfy. The constant mental noise becomes unbearable. And deep inside, there is still this quiet awareness that something essential is missing. Not religion, not performance, not image. Connection, real connection with God. And maybe what hurts most is remembering that you once believed prayer would fix everything quickly. You thought if you prayed hard enough, peace would immediately come. Answers would arrive. Fear would disappear. But life became more complicated than that expectation. Some prayers seemed unanswered. Some wounds stayed open longer than expected. Some seasons stretched beyond your understanding. And disappointment slowly weakened your desire to keep talking. People rarely admit this openly, but disappointment with life can quietly affect intimacy with God. Not always through anger, sometimes through fatigue, sometimes through confusion, sometimes through silent emotional withdrawal. You still believe God is real, but you no longer know how to process the silence. And that creates an internal conflict. Many believers secretly carry. You want to return to prayer, but you are afraid of what you will feel when you try. Afraid of emptiness, afraid of guilt, afraid nothing has changed, afraid God feels farther away now. But beneath all those fears is a deeper question you may not have fully faced yet. What if the relationship was never held together by your strength in the first place? What if God's faithfulness did not disappear during your silence? And what if the very thing shame is telling you to avoid is actually the place where healing begins? Because the truth about silent seasons may be very different from what your fear has been telling you. One of the hardest parts about spiritual exhaustion is that it changes the way you see everything. Not just yourself, not just your circumstances. It changes the way you interpret God. When your heart feels heavy for too long, your emotions slowly start becoming the lens through which you measure spiritual reality. And if you are not careful, you begin assuming that what you feel must automatically be true. If you feel distant, you conclude God is distant. If you feel forgotten, you assume God forgot you. If you feel spiritually weak, you believe your faith is failing. But feelings are real without always being reliable. That tension matters more than most people realize, because there are seasons where your emotions tell a completely different story than what God is actually doing beneath the surface. The human mind naturally searches for evidence. It wants visible reassurance, immediate clarity, emotional confirmation. But faith often grows in places where external confirmation feels absent, and that can become deeply uncomfortable, especially when you have been carrying silent disappointment for a long time. Sometimes you expected life to look different by now. You expected healing to come sooner. You expected clarity after praying so many times. You expected certain doors to open. You expected peace to arrive after all the tears and waiting. But instead, the struggle continued. And little by little, your heart became tired of hoping. Not always consciously, not dramatically, just quietly. That quiet emotional fatigue is dangerous because it rarely announces itself immediately. It develops internally before it becomes visible externally. At first, you still pray even while exhausted. Then the prayers become shorter, then more distracted, then inconsistent. Then eventually, silence starts feeling easier than vulnerability, because prayer requires honesty, and honesty can feel exhausting when your heart is already carrying disappointment. There are moments where people stop praying not because they no longer care, but because they no longer know what to say. They have repeated the same fears to God so many times that they wonder if anything changes by speaking again. So they become quieter. But here is what often goes unseen during those seasons. Silence from your side does not mean absence from God's side. That truth can feel difficult to believe when emotions are heavy. But throughout Scripture, God repeatedly remained present during seasons where people felt weak, confused, afraid, or spiritually overwhelmed. Sometimes we imagine faith as constant emotional confidence, but biblical faith was often messy, human, honest. There were people who waited for years without understanding what God was doing, people who questioned, people who grieved, people who felt emotionally crushed, people who experienced silence they could not explain. Yet God did not abandon them in those moments. And that matters, because one of the biggest misunderstandings about prayer is believing that prayer keeps God close, as if His presence depends entirely on human consistency. But God's faithfulness has never depended on human perfection. If that were true, nobody would survive spiritually. The relationship between God and people has always involved grace, always involved mercy, always involved patience. Even when human beings fluctuated emotionally, spiritually, and mentally, the problem is that shame makes you interpret weakness as rejection. It tells you you failed spiritually. You ruined your connection with God. You should hide until you become stronger again. But hiding has been humanity's instinct since the beginning. In Genesis, after Adam and Eve sinned, their immediate reaction was not restoration. It was hide. Fear entered their minds. Shame distorted their perception, and suddenly they became afraid of the God who had been walking with them. That pattern still exists today. When people feel spiritually exposed, they often withdraw internally. Not because God pushed them away, but because shame convinced them to step back. And shame is persuasive when your emotions are already exhausted. Especially in modern life, where mental noise never seems to stop. Your mind becomes crowded every day. Notifications, responsibilities pressure, comparison fear about the future, overthinking at night, constant internal conversations, and somewhere beneath all that noise, your soul becomes tired. Not loud tired, quiet tired. The kind of exhaustion where even small spiritual efforts feel emotionally difficult. You open your Bible but struggle to focus. You attempt to pray but your thoughts wander immediately. You hear truth but feel disconnected from it emotionally. And then another dangerous assumption begins forming. If I do not feel spiritually alive, maybe I am spiritually far gone. But emotional numbness is not always evidence of spiritual death. Sometimes it is evidence of emotional overload. Human beings are not designed to carry endless anxiety without internal consequences. Fear affects focus. Stress affects clarity. Exhaustion affects emotional connection. Even physically, tired minds struggle to engage deeply. God understands this more than you think. One of the beautiful truths throughout Scripture is that God consistently dealt gently with exhausted people. Not just rebellious people, exhausted people. People carrying fear. People overwhelmed by life. People mentally weary. People emotionally fragile. And yet many believers still secretly imagine God responding to weakness with frustration. Why? Because guilt distorts the character of God. When shame dominates your thoughts, you stop seeing God clearly. You begin projecting your own disappointment onto Him. You assume He is impatient because you feel disappointed in yourself. You assume He is distant because you feel disconnected internally. But God is not as unstable as human emotions. His presence does not disappear every time your feelings fluctuate. That does not mean spiritual drift is harmless. Silence matters. Neglect affects intimacy. But the deeper truth is that God's commitment to you was never built on emotional consistency alone. And this changes the entire way you understand silent seasons. Because maybe your greatest problem is not that God abandoned you. Maybe the greater issue is that fear convinced you He did. There is an important difference. One leads to hopelessness. The other opens the door to restoration. Right now, your emotions may still resist this idea. Maybe you think, if God is still near, why do I feel this way? If God still cares, why does prayer feel difficult? If God has not left, why does everything feel spiritually dry? Those are honest questions. But spiritual dryness does not always mean God moved away. Sometimes it reveals deeper internal wounds that need healing. Sometimes your heart has been operating in survival mode for so long that peace feels unfamiliar. Sometimes anxiety becomes so loud that it drowns out quiet trust. And sometimes God allows you to recognize your deeper need for Him beneath all the distractions you once depended on. Because there is a difference between knowing about God and truly depending on Him. Often people only discover the condition of their inner life when the noise settles enough to expose it. That exposure can feel painful at first, but pain exposed is often the beginning of healing. And maybe that is why this season feels so uncomfortable. Not because God is punishing you, but because your soul is finally becoming aware of how exhausted it truly is. Awareness is uncomfortable before it becomes freeing, especially when you realize how much fear has shaped your thoughts lately. Fear about the future, fear of failure, fear of never changing, fear of disappointing God, fear that your faith will never feel strong again. Fear slowly drains intimacy because it keeps the mind trapped in survival mode. Instead of resting in God's presence, your thoughts stay consumed with self-protection, control, and overanalysis. But faith grows differently. Faith does not begin with having all the answers. It begins with trusting God's character, even when emotions fluctuate. And that trust becomes most important precisely during silent seasons. Because what if God's presence was never measured by how emotionally connected you felt in a moment? What if He remained near, even while your mind was overwhelmed? What if your exhaustion never canceled His mercy? And what if prayer was never meant to begin with polished strength, but with honest weakness brought into His presence? One of the quiet reasons many people stop praying is because they begin believing they are doing it wrong. They think prayer only matters when it sounds spiritual enough, long enough, focused enough, consistent enough. So when exhaustion enters their life and they no longer have polished words, they slowly begin avoiding prayer altogether. Because somewhere along the way, prayer became associated with performance instead of connection. You may not say that out loud, but internally many believers carry this pressure. They feel like they need to approach God correctly before they can approach Him honestly, as if weakness disqualifies intimacy. But throughout Scripture, some of the deepest moments of prayer were not polished at all. They were desperate, confused, emotional, sometimes even silent. There were moments where people cried out in grief without fully understanding what God was doing. Moments where fear and faith existed together in the same heart. Moments where exhaustion became so overwhelming that people had no strength left to pretend, and God still listened. That matters because your view of prayer shapes your willingness to return to it. If prayer feels like a test, you will avoid it when you feel weak. If prayer feels like pressure, Guilt will eventually silence you. If prayer feels like performance, exhaustion will make it unbearable. But prayer was never designed to be proof of spiritual perfection. It was always meant to be relational. Real relationship includes honesty, not manufactured honesty. Not religious honesty, actual honesty. The kind where you stop filtering every emotion before bringing it to God. The kind where you admit, I feel tired. I do not understand this season. My mind feels overwhelmed. I want to trust you, but fear keeps interrupting me. I do not even know what to say anymore. Many people think God is most pleased when they sound spiritually strong, but often the deepest faith begins when pretending finally ends, because pretending creates distance. You cannot have genuine intimacy while constantly hiding your actual condition, and that hiding happens more often than people realize. Some people hide behind religious language, others hide behind busyness, others hide behind silence. Others convince themselves they will reconnect with God later, when life feels more organized emotionally. But healing rarely begins through avoidance. It begins through honesty. That is why prayer is not primarily about eloquence. It is about openness. And openness becomes difficult when shame has been shaping your thoughts for a long time. Shame tells you to clean yourself up before approaching God. Truth invites you to come as you are. Those are two completely different messages. One creates paralysis, the other creates restoration. You may think your struggle disqualifies you from closeness with God right now, but the reality is that weakness often becomes the very place where deeper dependence begins. Strong illusions of self-sufficiency rarely produce intimacy with God, but honest awareness of need does. And perhaps that is part of what this season is exposing. Not just your exhaustion, your dependence. For a long time, maybe you carried more internally than you admitted. You tried managing fear through overthinking. You tried controlling uncertainty mentally. You tried staying emotionally functional even while your soul became increasingly tired. But eventually, human strength reaches its limit. And when that happens, many people interpret the collapse emotionally instead of spiritually. They think, I am failing. My faith is weak. I should be doing better. But what if part of spiritual growth is finally recognizing you were never meant to carry life alone? Prayer becomes different when you stop viewing it as a spiritual obligation and start seeing it as a place of surrender. Not surrender because you have everything figured out. Surrender because you finally recognize you do not. That shift changes everything, because now prayer is no longer about impressing God. It becomes returning to Him honestly. And honest prayer does not always sound impressive. Sometimes it is quiet. Sometimes it is broken. Sometimes it is tearful. Sometimes it is simply sitting in silence because words feel too heavy. But silence before God is still different than distance from God. That distinction matters. There are seasons where your heart is too exhausted for structured words, yet still deeply longing for His presence. God understands the language of the heart, even when the mouth struggles to explain it. Romans speaks about this reality in a powerful way. It describes how the Spirit helps in human weakness, because sometimes people do not even know how to pray as they should. That truth is deeply comforting because it means God's understanding reaches beyond your ability to articulate everything perfectly. You do not have to explain your pain flawlessly for God to understand it completely. You do not have to organize every emotion before bringing it to Him. And maybe that feels unfamiliar because so much of life teaches you the opposite. In the world, people often feel pressure to appear composed, capable, emotionally controlled. Weakness feels risky. Vulnerability feels uncomfortable. But God already sees what you were trying to hide. Not with condemnation, with understanding. And that changes the atmosphere of prayer entirely. Imagine how differently you would approach God if you truly believed He already understood your exhaustion without rejecting you for it. Imagine approaching Him without rehearsing religious language first, without trying to sound spiritually impressive, without pretending your mind is not struggling. Just honesty. That is where genuine reconnection often begins. Not through dramatic spiritual moments, through truthful ones. And the truth is, many people are more exhausted than they admit. Emotionally exhausted from carrying anxiety. Mentally exhausted from constant overthinking. Spiritually exhausted from trying to hold themselves together internally. Some even become afraid of stillness, because stillness exposes how overwhelmed they actually feel. So they stay distracted, scrolling, working, consuming noise, filling every quiet space, because quiet moments often force hidden emotions to surface. But eventually, the soul begins asking for something deeper than distraction. You can feel that sometimes, even when you cannot fully explain it, there is this internal longing for peace that temporary distractions never fully satisfy. A longing to feel grounded again. A longing to stop carrying everything mentally all the time. And this is where prayer slowly becomes beautiful again, not as duty, but as relief. Not because all problems instantly disappear, but because you stop carrying them alone internally. Philippians speaks about bringing anxieties to God instead of holding them endlessly within yourself. Not because life immediately becomes easy, but because peace begins guarding the heart and mind differently. That peace is not always loud emotionally. Sometimes it arrives quietly. Sometimes it begins simply by no longer hiding. And maybe this is important for you to understand right now. God is not asking you to return with perfected strength. He is inviting you to return honestly. There is a difference. One creates fear. The other creates safety. Because if you believe you must become spiritually impressive before reconnecting with God, you will remain trapped in delay. You will keep waiting to feel worthy enough, focused enough, disciplined enough. But if relationship with God begins through grace, then returning begins with honesty, not perfection. That means even small prayers matter. Even distracted prayers, even exhausted prayers, even moments where all you can say is, God, I need you. Help me. I feel tired. I want to come back. I do not know how to fix this. Those prayers are not weak to God. Sometimes they are the most genuine prayers a person has spoken in a very long time. And maybe the reason your heart still feels unsettled during this season is because deep down, you were never meant to survive spiritually through distance and self-protection alone. Maybe your soul has been longing for reconnection more than you realized. But before reconnection fully happens, something else must first be confronted. The voice that keeps telling you to stay away. There is a voice that often becomes louder during silent seasons. Not the voice of peace, not the voice of truth, the voice of shame. It speaks quietly at first, but over time it becomes persuasive, especially when your faith already feels fragile. It tells you things like, you waited too long to come back. You should be ashamed of how distant you became. God is tired of your inconsistency. Had your chance. You are not the person you used to be spiritually. And if those thoughts remain unchallenged long enough, they slowly shape the way you approach God, or more accurately, the way you avoid Him. Because shame always pushes people into hiding, not healing. Hiding. It convinces you that distance is safer than honesty, that if you stay away long enough, maybe you can avoid facing your spiritual condition. But avoiding God never actually heals the soul. It only delays the restoration your heart deeply needs. Yet many people stay trapped there for years. Not because God rejected them, because shame convinced them to reject themselves. That is why this internal battle is so important. The struggle is not only about prayer anymore. It is about what you believe God feels toward you right now. Do you believe He responds to weakness with mercy or with disappointment? Your answer changes everything. Because if you secretly believe God is mostly frustrated with you, you will never approach Him freely. Every attempt at prayer will feel tense, forced, fearful. You will constantly feel like you need to prove sincerity before receiving closeness. But the gospel has never been about earning your way back into God's presence through flawless performance. It has always been about grace meeting human weakness. And grace becomes most meaningful precisely in moments where people feel least deserving of it. That truth is difficult for many people to fully accept emotionally. You may understand grace intellectually while still living internally, as though God's love depends on your consistency. So every failure feels catastrophic. Every dry season feels permanent. Every struggle feels like evidence that you are spiritually disappointing God beyond repair. But Scripture repeatedly reveals a different pattern. Again and again, God met imperfect people with compassion. Not because sin did not matter, not because drift was insignificant, but because mercy was always greater than human failure. Think about how often people in the Bible came to God carrying fear, confusion, weakness, and regret. Rarely did restoration begin with people having everything together emotionally. Usually, restoration began when people finally stopped running. That matters because shame survives through distance. The longer you stay away internally, the more distorted your perception becomes. You begin imagining God through the lens of fear instead of truth. And fear is a terrible interpreter of God's character. Fear exaggerates rejection. Fear assumes abandonment. Fear turns weakness into hopelessness. Fear says, do not come close until you fix yourself. But if human beings could fully fix themselves before coming to God, grace would never be necessary. One of the enemy's greatest strategies is keeping wounded people spiritually isolated through condemnation. Because condemnation, it convinces you that returning is pointless, that you are too inconsistent, too weak, too far gone emotionally. But condemnation and conviction are not the same thing. Conviction draws you toward God. Condemnation pushes you away from Him. That distinction is crucial. Conviction may expose truth honestly, but it does so with the purpose of restoration. Condemnation exposes weakness while removing hope. And many believers live under condemnation without realizing it. They constantly replay failures mentally. They obsess over spiritual inconsistency. They focus more on their weakness than on God's mercy. As a result, prayer becomes emotionally associated with guilt instead of safety. But what if God is not waiting for you with rejection? What if He is waiting with open arms instead? That image may sound simple, but emotionally it changes everything. Because many people approach God as though they are walking into disappointment. Yet throughout Scripture, God continually moved toward broken people with compassion. Even when they failed, even when they wandered, even when fear clouded their thinking. One of the most powerful truths about God is that His mercy is not fragile. Human patience is fragile. Human emotions fluctuate. Human relationships often weaken under inconsistency. But God's mercy does not collapse every time you struggle. Lamentations says His mercies are new every morning. That means your silent season did not exhaust His willingness to receive you. Think about that carefully. You may feel emotionally exhausted with yourself, but God is not exhausted in the way humans are. He is not sitting in frustration waiting for you to become spiritually impressive again before allowing closeness. The story of the prodigal son reveals something profound about God's heart. The son expected rejection. He rehearsed shame. He prepared himself to return as someone unworthy. But before he could fully present his apology, the father ran toward him. That story is not only about rebellion, it is also about misunderstanding the heart of the father. The son believed distance changed the relationship permanently. The father never stopped loving him. And maybe part of your pain right now comes from believing your silent season permanently altered God's posture toward you. But God's character is more stable than your emotions. That does not mean silence should remain forever. Restoration matters. Intimacy matters. Returning matters. But you do not return to earn love back. You return because His love remained even during the distance. That realization weakens shame's power, because shame depends on the assumption that God no longer wants closeness with you. But truth says otherwise. Truth says God still invites weary people. Truth says God remains near to the brokenhearted. Truth says mercy still exists after failure. Truth says weakness does not scare God away. And maybe this is why Jesus consistently welcomed exhausted people. Not people pretending to have perfect lives. Exhausted people. Burdened people. People carrying heavy inner worlds. Come to me, He said, all of you who are weary and burdened. Notice the invitation. Not, come to me once you become stronger. Not, come to me once your emotions are fixed. Not, come to me once your prayer life becomes perfect. Just come. Simple, direct, merciful, because relationship with God was never sustained through human perfection. It was sustained through His faithfulness. That means your return does not begin with proving worthiness. It begins with trusting His mercy enough to stop hiding. And maybe that is the real battle happening inside you right now. Not whether God is willing to receive you, whether you believe He is, because shame keeps insisting, stay away, but truth keeps whispering, come back. And somewhere between those two voices, your soul is deciding which one to trust. The difficult part is that shame often feels emotionally convincing, especially after long periods of spiritual silence. You may still feel numb. You may still feel disconnected emotionally. You may still struggle to pray consistently tomorrow. But restoration rarely begins with instant emotional transformation. Usually it begins with one honest step toward God despite fear. One prayer, one moment of surrender, one decision to stop running internally. And often the first breakthrough is not emotional intensity. It is finally realizing that God's posture toward you has not changed as much as shame told you it had. But there is still another fear many people quietly carry during these seasons. If God has truly remained near this whole time, then what was He doing in the silence? One of the deepest fears people experience during silent seasons is not only wondering where they have been spiritually, it is wondering where God has been. Because when life becomes painful and prayers seem unanswered, the silence starts feeling personal. You begin asking questions you may never say out loud to anyone else. If God was near, why did this season hurt so much? If He cared, why did I feel so alone? If He was working, why could I not see it? Those questions become even heavier when the waiting lasts longer than expected. At first, you may have believed breakthrough was close. You thought clarity would come quickly. You assumed peace would eventually replace confusion after enough prayer, enough faith, enough patience. But then time passed, and sometimes prolonged waiting changes people internally, not always externally. Internally, the mind becomes tired of carrying hope. The heart becomes cautious. The soul begins protecting itself from disappointment. And gradually, spiritual numbness develops as a survival response. That numbness can feel frightening because it creates the illusion that nothing meaningful is happening anymore. You stop feeling emotionally connected. Your passion weakens. Your consistency disappears. And because nothing seems visibly changing, you assume nothing is happening spiritually either. But some of God's deepest work happens invisibly. Seeds grow underground long before fruit appears externally. That pattern exists throughout creation and throughout spiritual life. Human beings naturally focus on visible evidence. We want immediate answers, immediate healing, immediate certainty. But God often works deeper than immediate emotions. He works beneath the surface, where transformation is less visible, but more lasting. And this is difficult because hidden growth rarely feels dramatic while it is happening. Sometimes it feels like silence. Sometimes it feels like waiting. Sometimes it even feels like weakness. But silence and absence are not the same thing. That distinction matters profoundly. There are seasons in Scripture where people could not immediately understand what God was doing. Joseph experienced years of confusion before purpose became visible. David spent long periods waiting between promise and fulfillment. Elijah reached moments of emotional exhaustion so intense that he wanted to give up entirely. These were not people abandoned by God. These were people walking through processes they did not fully understand yet. And maybe part of your struggle right now is that you expected God's work to always feel emotionally obvious. But often His work is quieter than that. Sometimes He is strengthening trust beneath your awareness. Sometimes He's exposing unhealthy dependence on control. Sometimes He is teaching you to seek Him beyond emotional highs. Sometimes He is healing parts of your heart you did not realize were wounded. Because not every silent season is punishment. Sometimes it is refinement. Refinement is uncomfortable because it removes illusions. It exposes what people truly depend on internally. Many believers discovered during difficult seasons that they relied more on emotional certainty than they realized. When emotions weaken, faith suddenly feels fragile. But genuine faith grows deeper than feelings. Feelings matter. Emotions matter. But emotions alone cannot sustain a person through every season of life. At isomi point trust must become anchored in God's character rather than emotional fluctuation. And that transition often happens painfully, especially for people who have spent months carrying invisible mental battles. Overthinking drains the soul slowly. Anxiety keeps the nervous system in constant tension. Fear repeatedly pulls the mind toward worst-case scenarios. And eventually, a person becomes emotionally exhausted without fully understanding why. Some people even begin feeling guilty for being tired. But God understands human fragility more compassionately than most people understand themselves. Psalm 103 says He remembers that we are dust. That verse reveals tenderness, not irritation. It reveals a God who understands limitation, a God who sees human weakness clearly without withdrawing love because of it. You may feel disappointed in how this season affected you emotionally, but God is not shocked by your humanity. He understands what fear does to the mind. He understands emotional exhaustion. He understands grief. He understands waiting. And perhaps one reason silent seasons become spiritually transformative is because they eventually expose how deeply people need grace. Not theoretical grace, daily grace, the kind that sustains imperfect people through confusing seasons. Because eventually you realize something important. You cannot heal your soul through self-pressure. Pressure may produce temporary religious activity, but it rarely produces intimacy. Fear-based spirituality exhausts people. It keeps them constantly trying to earn peace internally, constantly trying to prove and constantly striving to feel spiritually secure through performance. But peace grows differently. Peace grows where trust replaces control, and control is often the hidden addiction beneath anxiety. The mind keeps trying to predict everything, manage everything, prevent every possible pain, understand every unanswered question. But the human mind was never designed to carry omniscience. Some burdens become too heavy when held without surrender. That is why prayer matters so deeply, not as ritual, but as release. Not because prayer magically removes all difficulty immediately, but because it relocates the weight. When you carry every fear alone internally, your soul slowly collapses under pressure. But surrender begins redistributing those burdens into God's hands instead of endlessly recycling them inside your thoughts. This does not mean life instantly becomes easy, but it changes how you carry life. And maybe that is part of what God has been teaching beneath the silence. Not merely how to seek answers, how to depend on Him. Because dependence often develops most deeply in seasons where certainty disappears. Anyone can feel spiritually strong when life feels stable. But trust becomes real when clarity is incomplete and you still choose to believe God remains faithful. That kind of faith is quieter, less dramatic, but often far deeper. It is the faith that continues returning even after disappointment. The faith that keeps seeking God through emotional numbness. The faith that says, I do not understand everything right now, but I still want your presence. And maybe that desire itself is evidence that God has been working more than you realized, because hardened hearts stop caring completely. But your heart still longs for peace, still longs for truth, still longs for connection. That longing matters. Even if your prayers feel small right now, even if your emotions still fluctuate, even if your mind still battles fear, God often begins restoration long before people fully recognize it. The very fact that your soul feels unsettled by distance may itself be part of His invitation drawing you closer again. Not through condemnation, through mercy. And mercy changes the atmosphere of restoration entirely, because now the question is no longer, have I failed too much? The deeper question becomes, am I willing to trust God's love more than my shame? That is where transformation begins shifting internally. Not when every emotion instantly changes, but when truth slowly becomes louder than fear. And perhaps this is the realization your soul has been moving toward through this entire season. God was never absent simply because you struggled to feel Him emotionally. He remained faithful through every anxious night, every distracted day, every silent moment, every exhausted prayer, every season where you thought nothing was happening. And if that is true, then returning to Him is not restarting a broken relationship from the beginning. It is waking up to the reality that His presence never left. Returning to prayer often feels harder in your mind than it actually is. Not because prayer itself is complicated, but because fear has spent so much time turning it into something intimidating. After a long silent season, many people imagine they need to rebuild everything spiritually overnight. They think they need immediate discipline, immediate passion, immediate emotional intensity. But real restoration rarely happens that way. Most deep healing begins quietly, slowly, honestly, one small step at a time. And that is important because sometimes people never return to prayer simply because they make the return feel emotionally impossible. They wait until they feel spiritually strong again, until their thoughts are perfectly focused, until they suddenly feel motivated. But healing does not usually begin after strength appears. Strength often begins appearing after your return, even weakly, even imperfectly, even inconsistently at first. That changes the entire perspective, because now prayer is no longer about proving devotion. It becomes reopening communication with the God who never stopped listening. And maybe what you need most right now is not a dramatic spiritual performance. Maybe you simply need honesty again. Simple honesty. Not polished words, not long religious speeches, just real openness. God, I feel tired. My mind feels heavy. I do not know how to reconnect. Miss Peace, I want to trust you again. Those moments matter more than you realize. Sometimes people overlook small prayers because they compare them to who they used to be spiritually. But God is not asking you to recreate a previous version of yourself overnight. He is inviting you to meet Him honestly where you are now. And where you are now may still feel fragile. You may still wake up anxious some mornings. You may still struggle with overthinking. You may still feel emotionally numb at times. But healing is not measured only by emotional intensity. Sometimes healing is simply no longer running away. That alone is significant. Because for a long time, perhaps your inner world has been dominated by avoidance, avoiding stillness, avoiding vulnerability, avoiding the uncomfortable awareness that your soul needed reconnection. But now, something is changing internally. Not perfectly, not instantly, but genuinely. You are beginning to realize that God was never demanding flawless spirituality before allowing closeness again. That realization creates safety, and safety changes people. Fear-based spirituality constantly exhausts the nervous system. It keeps people striving internally, afraid of disappointing God, afraid of not doing enough, afraid of failing spiritually. But grace creates a different environment, an environment where honesty becomes possible again. And honesty is where intimacy grows. One of the practical ways restoration begins is through removing unnecessary pressure from prayer itself. Prayer does not always need to happen in long, uninterrupted periods to be meaningful. Sometimes connection with God begins in small moments throughout ordinary life. A quiet thought while driving, an honest conversation during a difficult evening, a few moments of surrender before sleep, a whispered prayer during anxiety, a deep breath where you stop mentally carrying everything alone. Those moments matter because relationship is built through continued openness, not perfection. And maybe that helps explain why Jesus often withdrew into quiet places. Not because performance mattered more there, but because silence creates space to reconnect beneath the noise. Modern life rarely gives your soul silence naturally. Everything competes for attention. Everything stimulates the mind. Everything demands emotional energy. As a result, many people become spiritually disconnected without realizing it because their inner life never slows down enough to breathe. That is why stillness can initially feel uncomfortable during restoration. When external noise decreases, internal emotions become more noticeable. Suddenly you recognize how tired your thoughts actually are, how much fear has been circulating beneath the surface, how much pressure you have been carrying internally. But awareness is not your enemy. Awareness is often the beginning of healing. Psalm 46 says, "Be still and know that I am God." Stillness is difficult for anxious minds because anxiety constantly searches for control. It keeps the brain active, analyzing, preparing, but stillness interrupts that cycle. It reminds your soul that God remains God, even when your thoughts feel chaotic. And slowly, through consistent honesty, prayer becomes less intimidating again. Not because every question disappears, but because you stop seeing God as someone you must impress. You begin seeing Him as refuge again. That word matters deeply. Refuge is where exhausted people rest. Refuge is where fearful people find safety. Refuge is where weary souls stop pretending to be stronger than they are. And perhaps your soul has needed refuge for longer than you admitted. Not more pressure, not more guilt. Refuge. Jesus described giving rest to weary souls. That invitation was never only about physical rest. It included internal rest, the kind, anxious hearts desperately need. Because anxiety creates constant inner tension. Even during quiet moments, the mind keeps moving. What if things never improve? What if I never feel close to God again? What if I always struggle like this? Fear constantly pulls you into imagined futures while stealing peace from the present moment. But prayer gently brings your attention back into God's presence instead of endless mental spiraling. Not always instantly, not magically, but gradually. Every honest prayer weakens isolation a little more. Every moment of surrender loosens fear's grip slightly. Every act of trust creates room for peace to grow again. And peace often returns quietly before it becomes emotionally obvious. That is important to remember. Sometimes people quit reconnecting too quickly because they expect immediate emotional transformation. But healing beneath the surface may already be happening long before emotions fully stabilize. A seed underground does not appear lifeless simply because growth is invisible. And perhaps your relationship with God is rebuilding more deeply than you can currently measure emotionally. This time, maybe it will not be built only on emotional highs. Maybe it will be rooted in truth. Truth that says God remained faithful during your silence. Truth that says mercy did not disappear when consistency weakened. Truth that says weakness does not cancel love. Truth that says returning is always possible. Those truths slowly rebuild spiritual confidence. Not confidence in yourself, confidence in God's character. And that distinction changes everything. Because if your relationship with God depends entirely on your emotional perfection, fear will always dominate eventually. But if the relationship rests on His faithfulness, then even weak people can approach Him honestly. Even tired people, even anxious people, even people rebuilding after silent seasons. And maybe this is what your heart is finally beginning to understand. Prayer was never supposed to feel like earning your way back into God's presence. It was always meant to be returning to the presence that never stopped reaching toward you, which means you do not have to carry shame into the future the way you carried it in the past. You can let it go. Not because you became perfect, but because God's mercy remains steady through every imperfect moment. And once that truth truly settles into the heart, something beautiful begins happening internally. Fear slowly loses its authority. Trust begins growing again, and the relationship you thought was broken beyond repair begins feeling alive once more. For a long time, you may have believed the most important question was, what happens when I stop praying for a while? But maybe the deeper question was always, what does God do during that silence? And now, you are beginning to see the answer more clearly. He does not disappear. He does not abandon. He does not stop inviting you back, even during the seasons where your mind was overwhelmed, even during the nights filled with anxiety, even during the days where you avoided prayer because guilt felt heavier than hope. God remained faithful, not because your emotions stayed strong, not because your consistency was perfect, but because His character does not fluctuate the way human emotions do. That truth changes the entire way you understand your relationship with Him, because now prayer is no longer about maintaining God's love through performance. It becomes responding to the love that remained present even during your weakest moments. And maybe that realization is what finally allows your soul to breathe again. You no longer have to carry the exhausting pressure of pretending. You no longer have to believe every fearful thought your mind produces. You no longer have to assume silence means abandonment. Instead, you can begin resting in something stronger than emotion. Truth. Truth says God still hears you. Truth says mercy still exists for you. Truth says grace did not run out because you struggled. Truth says Your silent season did not cancel your purpose. And purpose matters deeply here, because many people quietly lose hope during spiritually dry seasons. They begin believing their best spiritual days are behind them. They think God can still use other people, but not them. Not after the inconsistency, not after the distance. But Scripture repeatedly reveals God restoring people after weakness. Not only before it, Peter failed publicly and still became a foundational leader. David struggled deeply and still remained a man after God's heart. Elijah collapsed emotionally and still encountered God again. The disciples themselves wrestled with fear, doubt, confusion, and inconsistency. God has always worked through imperfect people. That does not excuse spiritual drift, but it does reveal something beautiful about grace. Weakness does not automatically remove you from God's hands. In fact, sometimes broken seasons become the very places where faith becomes more real than it was before. Because now your faith is no longer built only on emotional momentum. Now it understands dependence. Now it understands mercy. Now it understands the difference between performance and relationship. And that kind of faith often becomes quieter but stronger. Not louder externally, deeper internally. You stop chasing constant spiritual feelings and begin anchoring yourself in God's unchanging character instead. You learn that peace is not always the absence of struggle, but the presence of God within it. Life may still contain uncertainty after this. Some prayers may still require waiting. Some questions may still unfold slowly. But something important has changed inside you now. You are no longer interpreting your entire relationship with God through shame. That shift is powerful because shame kept you trapped in fear. Fear kept you distant. Distance kept you exhausted. But truth interrupts that cycle. Truth reminds you that God never asked you to carry life alone. Truth reminds you that His presence remained available even during your silence. Truth reminds you that returning does not require perfection, it requires willingness. And perhaps that is all God has been waiting for. Not flawless performance on an open heart. Even now, maybe your prayers still feel simple. Maybe they still feel quieter than they once did. That is okay. Authentic connection matters more than dramatic emotion. Sometimes, the most powerful spiritual moments happen quietly, not in emotional intensity, but in honest surrender. In the moment you stop hiding, in the moment you finally believe mercy is still available, in the moment you whisper, God, I'm here again. That moment matters deeply, because restoration often begins before emotions fully catch up. You may still have difficult days ahead, days where anxiety returns, days where overthinking becomes loud again, days where your emotions fluctuate. But now you know something you did not fully understand before. Your relationship with God is not sustained by emotional perfection. It is sustained by His faithfulness. And that means fear no longer gets the final word. God does. The same God who stayed near during your silence. The same God who understood your exhaustion. The same God who never stopped inviting you back even when shame told you to stay away. Maybe that is why your soul still felt restless during this season. Because deep down, you were never meant to live disconnected from the one who gives true peace. Not temporary distraction. Not temporary relief. Real peace. The kind that steadies the heart even while life remains uncertain. The kind that quiets fear little by little. The kind that reminds you that you are still loved, still seen, still held by grace. And perhaps right now, for the first time in a long time, prayer no longer feels like pressure. It feels like home. Not because every struggle instantly disappeared, but because you finally understand that God was never asking you to return as a perfected version of yourself. He was simply asking you to return. So if you have been carrying guilt about your silent season, you can release it now. If you have been afraid that God became distant, you can let that fear go. If you have been wondering whether it is too late to reconnect, the answer is no. It is not too late. It was never too late. God's mercy was already reaching toward you long before you found the strength to reach back. And maybe tonight, instead of overthinking every failure, you can rest in this truth. The God you thought you needed to find again was never truly lost. If this message spoke to your heart, Take a moment to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more biblical encouragement and spiritual clarity for everyday life. And remember this quietly as you move forward. Even when your prayers became silent, God's invitation to come close never did.